Hey there folks, welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about music, movies, art, and culture. And today we're going to be talking about the sophomore album from Cher Lloyd, titled Sorry, I'm Late. Now, I've got a complicated relationship with Simon Cowell. On the one hand, I've got a certain amount of respect for him as a businessman, and his critical feedback on shows like American Idol always held the most weight to me because he wasn't about to mince words and not tell it exactly like it is. Sure, he was abrasive and obnoxious, but as a record executive with an eye who tended to get popular in mainstream music, I completely get his motivation in finding and crafting pop acts into something fit to sell. He's going into pop music as a businessman, not as an artist, and to some degree, pop has to fit in the intersection between those two subsectors, and honestly, that's the eye he was looking for the songs, because he knew what would sell. But on the other hand, he also has a reputation for being responsible for promoting some of the most blandest, most interchangeable pop music alive. The sort of power chord heavy, shallow dreck that you can only take so far, even in the mainstream. The man has made an absolute killing making disposable music and shoving artists through the meat grinder. The acts that have some personality or some artistic flavor, like say Kelly Clarkson, they're the ones that survive. The rest go the route of myriad Idol and X Factor finalists, and even some winners, and just vanish into obscurity. And much to my surprise though, Cher Lloyd seems to be one of the few acts that, from one of his shows, who was a finalist on his show, not even a winner, was a real crack at keeping her career alive. When in reality, let's be honest here, it should have been dead on arrival. I'm not denying, look, that she has charisma and a good voice, but a song like Swagger Jagger should have been the last thing anyone ever heard from her, because that song is awful. And when she crossed over to the States and released Want You Back, I was once again that her career didn't fade instantly. Because look, while Swagger Jagger was its own unique brand of bad, Want You Back was one of the worst hit songs of 2012. A near unlistenable brand of bitchiness, bad stiff instrumentation, and the fusion of bad Avril Lavigne and Kesha reject demos. I hate that song. In other words, for me, Cher Lloyd's already had her two strikes, and thus I was inclined to be a little bit charitable going into her long-delayed sophomore album, Sorry I'm Late. And look, I didn't expect this album to be good. The only song I've ever really liked associated with Cher Lloyd before this record was Really Don't Care, the deep cut duet she had with Demi Lovato on her last album. But on the other hand, this was a record that was recorded with a certain amount of conflict between Cher Lloyd and Simon Cowell's label Psycho Records over the direction of her music, which was at least promising. Maybe Cher Lloyd had some artistic intent that had been quashed back before. So did Cher Lloyd prove me wrong with this new album? Honestly, I just don't know. Well, I think this Cher Lloyd album is not irredeemable, and it's not without merit. It's not particularly all that good either, especially when you consider an already oversaturated landscape with female pop singers. And while Cher Lloyd is a loud, very distinctive voice in that scene, the question of whether or not she's bringing anything new or all that different enough to the table to actually distinguish herself has yet to really be answered. In other words, it's a toss-up whether or not this record actually deserves some sort of recommendation, because while it wasn't quite as bad as I was expecting, at least, it's not exactly good either. So okay, let's start with Cher Lloyd herself, who as a singer seems to be trying to fill the void between Kesha and Natalia Kills, incorporating some of Kesha's brashness with Natalia Kills' brand of sultry glam. And honestly, there are points where Cher Lloyd makes it work pretty damn well. There are large chunks of this album where she's trying to convey vulnerability and desperation, and she sells it pretty damn effectively. It does help that she has a lot of natural vocal talent and a knack for very expressive, emotional delivery. Now that said, there are points when that sort of delivery can definitely backfire on her, and that crops up on songs where she attempts to go for a bit of a faster rapping cadence. And as with before, it's just not a good fit for her, partially because her rhymes are completely uninspired and rather generic, and because her delivery just comes across as obnoxious and snooty when trying to maintain that balance between brash and composed. Mostly because, well, she's nowhere near raw enough to pull off the former, and she's not nearly composed enough to pull off the latter. Now, granted, I think the lyrics are really part of the problem here. You know what? Problem is the wrong word here. Maybe it's issue, because much to my surprise, there are some songs on this album that have some pretty solid lyrics that place Cher Lloyd in a real place of vulnerability and let her sell her pipes, and that really push her to show off her more emotional side. Songs like The Lonely Desperation and Sirens, the moment of exploring her flaws and Human, the Not Over You ballad Sweet Despair, and the heartbreaking track Goodnight, a stripped down acoustic number that she sings about her father. They're easily easily some of the best songs that Cher Lloyd has ever done, and show her as a very solid contender in the realm of expressive ballads, all of which are a lot more tolerable than her shallower, more plastic dance tracks. Now, the one, at least for me, that was mostly tolerable was Alone With Me, a dance song where Cher Lloyd isn't dancing but standing in the corner and hoping to be noticed by the guy who's tearing up the dance floor. That's a interesting enough sentiment. I kind of like the way she framed that song. But you know what, in fact, one of the more interesting elements about this album, at least in thematically, could be considered desire itself. Because unlike the majority of artists singing about what they already have and saying that we don't have it, Cher Lloyd is nearly always placed in a position of wanting something, which can be a little bit more flattering and humanizing, makes her more of an underdog. On her best song, she can sell that desperation and passion for something, yet at her worst, it comes across as just painfully vapid. I Wish has already gotten some pretty justly deserved scorn from other critics about a song where Cher Lloyd wishes she wants to be taller and faster, have more money, a bigger rack, and a bigger ass so she can win over some guy who honestly sounds just about as vapid as she is on that song. But then T.I. comes along with a guest verse showering her with compliments and attention, which completely undercuts the entire presence of the song because now she has all these things. But you know what? It gets even worse when Cher Lloyd just trying to sing about some of her bad relationships in songs. The first being the subtly toxic back and forth of Just Be Mine, and the latter being this album's worst track by a mile, Dirty Love. Aside from terrible instrumentation and stealing one of the titles of Kesha's one of her best songs, Dirty Love is a song describing how Cher Lloyd is bored, and she's sick of guys who are actually being nice to her, and just wants the guy to be like a caveman. Yes, that's the analogy she uses, complete with grunting. Now, to be fair, I think the song knows that it's moronic and retrograde and has a terrible message. I mean, how can it not? But at the same time, it's nowhere near well written enough or framed properly to imply that Cher Lloyd wants something that isn't unpredictable or possibly dangerous for all of the wrong reasons, which is honestly the much bigger problem with that song. But you know what? Even the bad tracks could have been at least somewhat redeemable if the instrumentation was any good. And here's where we run into the big glowing red weak point of this album, because to even say that the production on this album is a mixed bag is underselling it. To be blunt, the majority of the production on this album feels phoned in, lackluster, and cheap, trading on heavy percussion over proper melody lines, overfilling the mix with electronic squeals and effects that do nothing for the overall presentation, nothing to accentuate her presence in the mix, and then just cranking up the reverb instead of letting the sounds naturally build depth. Take the guitars on Bind Your Love. The tone of the guitars is fine, but the sound is all flattened out in order to fit with the scratchy beat and glitchy high synth line, and thus the song loses all its organic flow. Even the opulence that normally comes through on T.I. tracks is completely gone. There's some of the cheapest horn production I've ever heard in this generation of pop music. But even when the instruments have a little bit more texture, the sounds are not given the chance to naturally grow throughout the mix and develop some depth, instead relying on reverb to intensify the sound just to make it heavier. And sure, it works for the percussion a bit on Human, but you lose emphasis on the melody lines outside of Cher Lloyd's voice, and thus the songs, they don't stick with me in the same way. They don't have that melodic catchiness. In comparison with Fox's heavier orchestration and yet tighter focus on the melodies, it's shocking how badly Cher Lloyd's material fares. It's also probably one of the reasons why Good Night is my favorite and objectively the best song on the album, with the guitars and the subtle strings arrangement and vocals stripped of unnecessary effects and relying entirely on Cher Lloyd's real talent and emotional delivery. And yeah, I'm not gonna lie, the vocal melodies a pretty close lift from Jennifer Rush's Power of Love, but Cher Lloyd makes the minimalist aesthetic work for her in the best possible way, and honestly, that saves the song. So in the end, look, this album, it's not as bad as I was expecting, but it's not precisely good here either. Part of this album I'm willing to blame on a compromised production. Conflicts with the label probably contributed to the frustrating dichotomy between this record's more subdued, the more songs that are significantly stronger, and the shallow, generic dance pop that Simon Cowell was likely jamming down her throat. And you know, I'm not gonna deny that Cher Lloyd is a solid singer, with the potential to be a pretty decent pop songwriter. But at the same time, just because I know where to assign the blame doesn't mean that this album's instrumentation is any less messy or the worst songwriting is any more excusable. In other words, this album's getting a 5 out of 10 from me, and only a recommendation if you haven't yet heard Natalia Kill's album from last year, Trouble, or Fox's new album, Glorious, because they're both a lot stronger than this. Otherwise, in an overcrowded pop landscape, you can find stuff that's a lot better than Cher Lloyd, and that doesn't have Simon Cowell's grubby hands all over it. But hey, thankfully he's no longer associated with her projects, so let's hope for better in the future. So yeah, thanks a lot for watching. If you'd like to like and subscribe, I'd be more than grateful. If there's anything I might be able to do to improve my presentation, or if there's any other albums coming out that you'd like me to take a look at, I'd be more than happy to give them a listen. So until then, I'm Mark, you're watching Spectrum Pulse, and I'll see you next time.